Survival Consortium. It was, without any exaggeration whatsoever, the single most respected institution in the known universe. 412 species had passed through its doors. 412 species had sat in its preparation chambers, sweated through its briefings, taken their allotted tools, and gone out into hostile planets to prove that they were, in fact, worthy of being called a spacefaring civilization. The consortium had been running its species readiness examination for over 6,000 cycles. 6,000 cycles of careful, measured, scientifically rigorous testing. Not one failure of procedure. Not one incident report that went beyond the standard template. Not one species that had ever made the senior observers question their life choices. That is, until the humans showed up. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. First, let us explain the test. Because the test matters. The test is important. The test is the entire reason that Chief Observer Venak Dral, a four-armed, blue-skinned, deeply professional Korvathi male with 30 years of spotless service on his record, ended up taking 6 weeks of mandatory stress leave and writing what would eventually become the best-selling memoir in galactic history. The test is why the word human is now used in 17 different languages as both a compliment and a warning, depending entirely on the tone of voice. The species readiness examination worked like this. A candidate species sent one representative. 1. The consortium believed strongly in individual performance as a proxy for species capability. The representative was placed in a preparation chamber. In that chamber, laid out on a table that stretched the full length of the room, were exactly 100 tools. Not random tools. Not useless tools. Carefully, lovingly, methodically selected tools curated over millennia of galactic experience, representing the absolute best equipment that any being could possibly want when dropped alone onto a hostile, uninhabited planet for 30 cycles. There was a water purification unit, there was a shelter-building kit, there was a long-range communicator for emergencies, there was a fire-starting apparatus, a medical scanner, a nutrient synthesizer, climbing gear, a weather analyzer, protective suits in multiple configurations, and 89 other items that the consortium's finest minds had agreed were essential for survival. Every single species that had ever taken the test, without exception, had taken between 60 and 90 of those tools. The Hravan took 73, and still nearly died on day 8 when they forgot how to recalibrate the water purifier. The Saltheki took 88 tools, and complained afterward that they had not had enough. The mighty, terrifying, galaxy-famous Drekthal warriors, who had a reputation for eating raw stone and sleeping inside active volcanoes, took 64 tools, and used every single one. 60 to 90 tools. That was the range. That was the data. That was 6,000 cycles of consistent, reliable, quantifiable evidence about how sentient species approached survival challenges. Venak Dral had seen all of it. He had catalogued all of it. He had written 14 academic papers about tool selection patterns and what they revealed about a species' psychological relationship with risk. He was, by any reasonable measure, the foremost expert on species readiness examination behavior in the entire consortium. He was completely, catastrophically, and almost comically unprepared for what happened next. The human's name was Silva Morozova. She was, by human standards, what you might call quietly striking. Not tall, not imposing, not the kind of figure that announced itself loudly when it walked into a room. She had dark hair pulled back from her face in a way that suggested practicality rather than style, sharp features that carried the kind of composed expression common to people from cold places, and pale eyes that moved around the preparation chamber with a slow, methodical quality, as though she was not simply looking at things but cataloging them. She walked in with the unhurried, measured step of someone who had decided, some time ago, that there was no situation worth rushing into before you had fully assessed it. She was wearing simple clothing. She had nothing with her. She had been told to bring nothing, because everything she would need was on the table. She looked at the table. From the observation deck above, Venak Dral and his team of 11 observers watched in respectful silence. This was a sacred moment. the moment of selection. The moment that would define humanity's readiness to join galactic civilization. Venik had his datapad ready. He had the standard intake form open. There was a field for number of tools selected, and he had his stylus hovering over it, ready to write a number somewhere between 60 and 90. Silva Morozova walked the length of the table slowly. She picked up the water purification unit. She looked at it. She put it back down. She picked up the shelter building kit. She turned it over in her hands. She put it back down. She picked up the nutrient synthesizer. She pressed a button on it. It beeped. She put it back down. She walked back to the beginning of the table. She picked up a knife. It was not a special knife. It was, in fact, one of the least impressive items on the table. It was a fixed-blade survival knife, approximately 23 centimeters long, with a full tang construction and a simple grip. The consortium had included it as item number 77 out of 100, rated as a supplementary tool, low priority, recommended as a secondary item only. It had never, in the entire history of the examination, been the first item selected. It had never been the only item selected. The very idea was absurd. Silva Morozova looked at the knife. She put it in her pocket. She turned and walked toward the exit door. The observation deck went completely silent. Then, all at once, it did not. "She is still choosing," said observer Pel Hassan, a young Korvathi female on her first assignment. Her voice had that specific quality of someone who was saying something out loud, mainly to stop themselves from screaming. "She has chosen," said Venik Dral very quietly. "She cannot have chosen. She has walked to the door. Perhaps she is going to come back. She is pressing the door release." A pause. "She is not coming back," said Venik Dral. The door slid open. Silva Morozova walked through it. The door slid closed behind her. 11 observers stared at a table with 99 tools still on it, and one empty spot where a mid-priority survival knife used to be. Venik Dral looked down at his datapad. He looked at the field that said, "Number of tools selected." He looked at his stylus. He wrote the number 1. Then he stared at it for a very long time, as though hoping it might change into a different number if he looked at it hard enough. It did not. He filed the intake form and immediately opened a new document titled Incident Report, Anomalous Tool Selection. Then he stopped because nothing in the incident report template had a field for this particular anomaly. He stared at the blank document for another long moment. Then he saved it, with no content, and went to get something to drink. The planet was called Vorith, 9 by the consortium's cataloging system, and it was not, by any reasonable definition of the word, a pleasant place to be. It had been selected specifically for its variety of survival challenges. The northern hemisphere featured dense, dark forest, full of large predatory fauna, and almost no edible plant life. The southern hemisphere was largely swamp, humid and hot, and full of things that bit. The equatorial band, where Silva had been deposited, featured open, rocky terrain, unpredictable weather systems that could produce lightning storms with almost no warning, a daytime temperature that fluctuated by 40 degrees between morning and afternoon, and exactly one species of plant that was safe to eat, which was small, bitter, and grew only near specific underground water sources that were completely invisible from the surface. The consortium had designed it to be solvable. With the right tools, a reasonably competent being could find water, build shelter, avoid the predators, and survive for 30 cycles with manageable difficulty. Without any tools except a knife, it was, according to every model the consortium had ever run, not compatible with sustained life for more than 3 to 5 cycles. Silva Morozova had been on the planet for approximately 4 hours, when she did the first thing that made Venik Dral's left eye start twitching. She found water. Not by luck, not by accident. She had spent those 4 hours walking a precise grid pattern across the rocky terrain, pausing occasionally to crouch down and press her bare hand flat against the ground. Then she had walked to a specific spot, looked at it, and started digging with the knife. 3 minutes of controlled, methodical digging, and water began seeping into the hole she had made. Observer Pel Hassan leaned toward her sensor console. She detected subsurface water using tactile analysis of soil moisture variance. She said, sounding genuinely confused. "She has no sensor equipment," said Venik Dral. "I am aware of that." She used her hand. "Yes, her bare hand. Chief Observer, I have eyes. I can see the feed." Venok made a note. "Tool 0, he muttered. "The hand." Before the first cycle was out, Silva had also constructed a shelter. Not a good shelter. By any standards the consortium would have recognized as legitimate construction. She had used rocks and branches and what appeared to be woven strips of something she had cut from a bush. And the result looked, from the observation feed, like something a large animal had partially eaten and then abandoned. It was, however, structurally sound. The storm that rolled through that evening, the kind of lightning storm that Vorath 9 was famous for, with horizontal rain and winds that would have scattered a standard consortium shelter kit if it had not been properly anchored, rolled over Silva Morozova's pile of rocks and sticks and did absolutely nothing to it. She slept inside it, dry, while the storm raged. Venik Dral wrote 4 more incident reports that night. Then he deleted all of them, because none of the templates fit. Then he went to bed, lay awake for 2 hours, got up, went back to the observation deck, and watched the feed in silence until morning. By day 3, the consortium's behavioral analysis team had been called in. The team consisted of 3 specialists, and the most important among them was a small, nervous, perpetually worried alien named Ques Pilaroth. Ques was a Threnish, which meant he was about 4 feet tall, had 4 eyes that moved independently of each other, and possessed the specific gift of being able to read behavioral patterns in other species with an accuracy that bordered on supernatural. He had spent his entire academic career studying pre-contact civilizations, which meant he had spent a lot of time thinking about what species did before they had access to galactic technology. He had never, personally, expected that knowledge to become immediately and urgently relevant. Ques watched the observation feeds from day 2 onward, with the expression of a being who had been handed information that contradicted something he had believed very firmly, and was in the process of deciding whether to update his beliefs, or simply cease to function. "The knife," said Venik Dral, on day 4, gesturing at the feed where Silva was using it to do something that appeared to involve shaping wood into a specific pointed form. "What is she making?" "A spear," said Ques, very quietly. "A spear?" "Yes. She has turned one knife into a spear. Technically, she has turned the knife, 2 branches, and some fibrous plant material into a spear. The knife is now functioning as a blade tip, lashed to the shaft with cordage she processed from that bush she stripped on day 1. Ques paused. "It is a good spear. She made a tool from a tool." "Yes, without any manufacturing equipment." "Chief Observer, I need to tell you something about humans," said Ques. He pulled up his own datapad, on which he had apparently been writing notes at a considerable pace since his arrival. "I have been reviewing the pre-contact cultural records that the consortium collected during initial observation of the human species, before they developed technology, before industry, before complex civilization, before agriculture even. And they did this," said Ques simply, gesturing at the feed, "for 200,000 years. They walked around their planet with nothing, and they survived everywhere, every environment, every climate, desert, Arctic, jungle, mountain, no fur, no claws, no natural armor, no echolocation, no venom, no exceptional speed, nothing that any other species would identify as a survival trait." The room was quiet. "Then what did they have?" asked Pel Hassan. Ques looked at her with all 4 eyes. "Stubbornness," he said, "and tools. Very, very simple tools, that they made more complex tools from, and then more complex tools from those, until eventually they had everything. They have been doing exactly what she is doing right now for longer than most species in this room have had written language." Everyone on the observation deck looked at the feed. On the feed, Silva Morozova was testing the balance of her new spear by throwing it at a rock, watching where it hit, adjusting the binding on the blade tip slightly, and throwing it again. She did this 11 times. Each throw was more accurate than the last. By day 6, She had also fashioned a fire-starting kit from materials available on the surface, a carrying system from the same bush fiber cordage she seemed to get considerable use from, and what appeared to be a crude but functional compass based on a magnetized sliver of the knife's blade that she had carefully separated and floated on a leaf in a pool of water. She magnetized it by striking it against another rock in a specific direction, repeatedly, for about 20 minutes. "She knows the planet's magnetic orientation?" said Venokdral. "She felt it," said Quess. "Humans have a mild sensitivity to magnetic fields. Most of them do not know this consciously. She appears to know it consciously." "How?" "I have no idea. I suspect someone told her, at some point, and she remembered." Vanek filed his 15th incident report. This one was titled, "Candidate Demonstrates Knowledge Base Inconsistent with Zero-Tool Survival Scenario." Then, he stared at it, and added a subtitle, "Please advise." Nobody advised him. The senior counsel was too busy having an emergency meeting about whether the test needed to be redesigned. A meeting that had started on day 4 and was still ongoing by day 9, with no clear end in sight. On day 14, the apex predator found Silva Morozova, the Vorith stalker, as the consortium's biologists had named it, was the single most dangerous animal on Vorith, 9. It massed approximately 600 kilograms. It had 4 legs, designed for silent movement over rocky terrain, a sensory system that could detect heat signatures at distances of up to half a kilometer, and a jaw structure capable of exerting pressure measured in the high thousands of newtons. No consortium examination candidate had ever encountered one directly. The standard protocol, embedded in the shelter building kit, the weather analyzer, and the perimeter alarm system that every candidate was expected to take, was to detect the animal at range and avoid it entirely. Silva Morozova had none of those systems. She found out the Vorith stalker was behind her when she heard it, approximately 15 meters away, in the dark of the 13th evening. The observation deck had been on elevated alert since the stalker's heat signature had appeared on the perimeter sensors 2 hours earlier. Venokdral was standing at the primary feed console, his 4 hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still. Quess Pilaroth was sitting in a corner with his datapad face down on his knee, because he had decided he did not want to write notes about what was about to happen. Pelha-Sun was pretending to review atmospheric data, and failing to look at anything except the feed. Silva heard the sound. She stopped walking. She did not run. She stood perfectly still for approximately 4 seconds, which, in the opinion of everyone watching, was 4 seconds longer than any of them would have managed. Then, very slowly and very deliberately, she reached into her pocket and took out the knife. "She is going to face it," said Pelha-Sun, in a voice that suggested she had not entirely decided whether this was the bravest or the most foolish thing she had ever witnessed. "Yes," said Quess, from his corner, "with the knife." The one knife she brought. What happened next took approximately 45 seconds, which was, in the estimation of the 11 beings on the observation deck, about 44 seconds longer than it had any right to take, and also 44 seconds shorter than they had steeled themselves for. The Vorith stalker charged. Silva moved in a direction that was not backward. There was a great deal of noise and motion that the observation sensors struggled to track clearly in the darkness. Then there was quiet. Silva Morozova was standing. The Vorith stalker was not. 3 things happened simultaneously on the observation deck. Observer Torak Mavish, a Korvathi male, with 22 years of experience, stood up, walked to the back of the room, and sat down on the floor with his back against the wall. Observer Pelha-Sun made a sound that was not a word in any language. Quess Pilaroth picked up his datapad, opened it, stared at the blank document he had been refusing to fill, and typed 6 words. Those 6 words were, "They have always been like this." Venokdral did not move for a full minute. Then he opened a new communication channel to the Senior Council's emergency meeting, which was still in progress, and said, simply and without preamble, "You need to watch the Night Cycle 14 feed before you make any decisions about redesigning the test." He closed the channel without waiting for a response. Silva spent the next hour calmly processing the animal she had just killed. She took what she could use. She left the rest. She went back to her shelter, sharpened the knife on a flat rock with the focused, unhurried attention of a craftsman performing routine maintenance, and went to sleep. Observer Torak Mavish requested psychological leave the following morning. 2 senior council members submitted the same request 40 minutes after watching the Night Cycle 14 feed. The requests were approved immediately and without question. The 30th cycle ended at precisely the 14th hour by standard consortium time. At the 13th hour, the observation deck was fuller than it had been at any point during the examination. Word had spread. It always did. The consortium was a large institution with a lot of employees, and absolutely no culture of keeping remarkable things quiet, and the human woman who took one knife had been remarkable from hour 1. By day 15, there were beings watching the archived feeds from other stations. By day 20, the senior council had quietly and without announcement begun attending observation sessions. By day 28, there was a formal request from the Galactic Academic Institute to access the complete recorded data, which Venok had approved with a numb efficiency that suggested he had long since stopped being surprised by anything. Silva Morozova on day 30 looked, cosmetically, different from Silva Morozova on day 1. Her dark hair had come loose from its practical arrangement and had decided, much like the situation around it, to do whatever it wanted. Her clothing was patched in multiple places with materials from the planet. She had a collection of minor cuts and bruises that the consortium's medical observers had catalogued and assessed as entirely survivable. She had lost some weight. She also looked, and this was the part that Quest Pilaroth had written about at considerable length in the notes that would eventually become the appendix to Venok's memoir, completely fine, not relieved, not traumatized, not desperate or frantic or in any way diminished by 30 cycles alone on a hostile planet with one knife. She looked like a being who had gone out for a long walk and found it somewhat challenging but broadly acceptable. She emerged from the rocky terrain at the pickup coordinates at the 13th hour and 41st minute, 19 minutes early. She stopped at the edge of the landing zone. She looked up at the sky, in the approximate direction of the observation satellite, with the expression of a being who was not entirely certain she was being watched, but was willing to bet on it. Then she put the knife back in her pocket. The shuttle came down. The door opened. Silva Morozova walked up the ramp. She looked at the consortium welcome officer, a young Threnish named Osek Vranik, who had been thoroughly briefed and was doing an admirable job of maintaining composure. She said, "Is there food?" Osek Vranik said, "Yes." Silva said, "Good. Thank you." She sat down. She ate 3 full portions of the standard consortium welcome meal, which was designed to be nutritionally complete and species-appropriate and tasted, by most accounts, like slightly seasoned air. She ate it with the focused appreciation of someone who had not eaten a prepared meal in 30 cycles and found even slightly seasoned air to be a significant improvement over what she had been working with. When she finished, she looked at Osek Vranik and said, "When do I get the results?" Osek Vranik said, carefully, "The full evaluation takes some time to process." Silva nodded. "Right," she said. "No rush." She leaned back in her seat, closed her eyes, and went to sleep before the shuttle had cleared the upper atmosphere. On the observation deck, nobody spoke for quite a long time. Then Venok Dral said, to no one in particular and everyone present, "Write everything down, all of it, every observation, every note, every reaction. I want it documented before anyone has time to convince themselves it was less extraordinary than it was." He said it quietly, but everyone heard him, and everyone started writing. The Galactic Survival Consortium convened a formal review board 11 cycles after Silva Morozova's examination concluded. The review board had 47 members and met for 6 days. They reviewed over 900 hours of observation footage, 14 sets of written analysis, 3 independent behavioral assessments, 1 lengthy document from Quest Pilaroth that had been submitted under the title Pre-Contact Human Survival History, a summary of why we should have expected this, and the 43 incident reports that Venok Dral had filed over the course of the 30 cycles, of which exactly none had fit the standard templates. On the 7th day, they issued their conclusions. The first conclusion was that Silva Morozova had passed the species readiness examination. This was not surprising. Passing required surviving 30 cycles on the designated planet. She had survived 30 cycles. She had technically complied with every rule. She had taken one of the available tools. She had not used any technology not provided by the consortium. She had completed the return journey under her own power. There were no grounds for disqualification. The review board had spent some time looking for grounds, not because they wanted to disqualify her, but because the alternative required them to update a very large number of systems and policies. And institutions of 6,000 cycles do not love updating very large numbers of systems and policies. They found no grounds. The second conclusion was that the species readiness examination required immediate and comprehensive revision. Specifically, the tool selection system needed to be rethought. Not because one tool was too few. The problem was more fundamental. The consortium's entire model of survival readiness was built on the assumption that tools were a species' primary survival resource. The examination tested how well a species could select and use external tools. It did not, and had never needed to, account for the possibility that a species might have internalized the concept of tool use so thoroughly over so many hundreds of thousands of years that they could effectively manufacture their own toolkit from raw environmental materials. The consortium did not have a rating for that. They needed one. The third conclusion was the one that generated the most discussion, the most disagreement, and ultimately the most paperwork. It was the recommendation to create a new classification tier for humanity in the consortium's species threat and capacity registry. The existing tiers ran from Category 1, covering species with limited technological capability and low environmental adaptability, through Category 7, which was reserved for species that possessed both advanced technology and significant biological advantages, such as the Drekthal, with their stone-eating and volcano-sleeping habits, 7 tiers, 412 species distributed across them. A system that had worked, without modification, for 6,000 cycles. The review board unanimously recommended the creation of Category 8. The description they drafted for Category 8 read, in the final approved version, as follows: species demonstrating survival capability that transcends standard tool dependence metrics, characterized by adaptive intelligence, environmental manipulation using minimal resources, and threat response behavior that does not correlate with available equipment. Caution level, elevated. Recommended approach, cooperation. Only one species was listed under Category 8. In the consortium's offices on 17 different stations, the notation next to the word human changed from its previous classification to the new one. Several administrators who processed the change request did a double-take. Several of them went and found the observation feeds from Vorath, 9-day 14. Several of them, after watching day 14, understood the classification completely. Venok Drowl, for his part, took his 6 weeks of stress leave and spent them writing. The memoir was titled simply One Tool. It was not, initially, intended for wide publication. He had written it as a personal processing exercise, the way some beings write in journals or talk to therapists. But Pel Hassan read a draft and told him, in the directest terms she had used in their entire working relationship, that he had no right to keep it to himself. He submitted it to the Galactic Academic Press on the last day of his leave. It was published 6 cycles later. It sold 4 million copies in the first cycle of release. The second printing had a foreword by Ques Pilaroth, which read, in its entirety, I told them. They did not believe me until they saw it. Now they believe me. The knife itself was retrieved from Silva Morozova by a very polite consortium acquisitions officer, who explained that the examination required all tools to be returned for cataloging. Silva handed it over without complaint. She asked if she could get it back after cataloging. The acquisitions officer said he would put in the request. The request was, ultimately, not honored. The knife went to the Galactic Survival Consortium's Museum of Examination History, which was housed on the consortium's primary station and attracted approximately 12,000 visitors per cycle. It was given its own case, in a room that had previously held the Drekthal candidates' tool selection display, which featured 64 items in a very impressive arrangement. The new case was significantly smaller. It held one item. The label underneath read, Survival Knife, Voreth, 9. Examination, Species, Human. Candidate, Silva Morozova. Tools, Selected, 1 of 100. Duration, 30 cycles. Outcome, Pass. Below the official label, someone had added a second, smaller card. It was not official. The museum staff had found it one morning and had a brief discussion about whether to remove it. Then they decided not to. The card read, She only needed one. Tourists stopped and read that card more than any other exhibit in the building. Some of them photographed it. Some of them just stood there for a while, looking at a simple fixed-blade knife in a glass case, and thought about what it meant. It meant that somewhere in the galaxy, there was a species that had spent 200,000 years learning to do more with less. A species that had looked at the vast, hostile, indifferent universe and decided, apparently, somewhere around the time they first picked up a sharp rock and thought, I could do something with this, that they were not going to be stopped by a lack of equipment. A species that had walked out of the wilderness of their own planet, carrying nothing but accumulated knowledge and the absolute, unshakable conviction that it was enough. It had been enough. Venok Drow's final line in his memoir, the line that every review cited, the line that got quoted in 14 languages and put on posters and carved into the wall of a university dormitory on 3 different planets, read, I was the foremost expert on species readiness examination behavior in the history of the consortium. I had seen everything. Then a human walked into my preparation chamber, picked up a knife, put it in her pocket, walked out the door, and taught me that I had never, not once, seen anything at all. Quest Pilaroth never did sleep well again. He said, later, that it was not fear. Exactly. It was more like the feeling of standing at the edge of a very long drop and suddenly understanding, clearly and viscerally, just how far down it went. He respected the drop. He respected it enormously. He just could not stop thinking about what it would feel like to be the kind of being that looked at that drop, shrugged, and asked if there was food at the bottom.